Government has decided to do away with the curfew for the first time since South Africa went into lockdown. These developments came after a special cabinet meeting. For reaction, I'm joined now by One South Africa movement leader, Mmusi Maimane. Mmusi, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us.
Good morning and good morning to fellow South Africans. Thank you for having me and wishing everybody a very prosperous and a strong 2022. It has to be better than 2021, surely.
It certainly does. Just your immediate reaction, Mmusi, to news of a Cabinet's decision to lift certain restrictions but also lift the curfew at midnight.
Well, I think to me we must look at the issue holistically. First and foremost, nations now recognize that COVID is no longer a disaster in that sense, in that whilst it's a pandemic, most parliaments all over the world have themselves created laws that should operate in this time. Secondly, that in fact we should have, given the fact that we knew COVID and COVID is going to be with us for the next year at least, that we should have suspended the Disaster Management Act and redrafted legislation that ensures that Parliament is at the center of it all. Because at this point in time, it feels like the executive led by President Ramaphosa can tell us when a curfew can be lifted, when it cannot be lifted, all of those things. It's not the way us as South Africans agreed that we ought to be governed. We said we must be governed by Parliament with its elected representatives. So to me, I lay the complete blame of these issues at the door of Parliament for having failed to produce laws that can govern us during COVID, for having not been able to consult with the people. Because tomorrow, we will be debating not a curfew, but something else. Now it must have been necessary for Parliament to have taken a lead because all of us must be represented, whether it's faith-based communities, whether it's liquor traders, whether it's civic society, all of them are represented in Parliament and must have a voice. We don't know on what basis they've decided to lift the curfew or not lift the curfew. So I can welcome the news of lifting the curfew, but it doesn't help that all other regulations still will remain to be adjusted as and when the executive feels. I think we must task Parliament early in the new year to say draft regulations that will help us govern during COVID so that we don't feel like we must be nice to President Ramaphosa so he gives us a curfew and not be nice. That's not how democracy works.
I mean, the issue that you're raising there, Mmusi, was one that was initially raised at the start of lockdowns, and that is, of course, the role that Parliament should be playing as South Africa endures this national disaster. Now, Minister in the Presidency, Mondli Gungubele, was just recently briefing media where he talked about how government would rather not, in fact, have the National Disaster Management Act in place presently. They would much rather have South Africans be allowed to continue leading normal lives under normal circumstances. However, we are living through a global health pandemic. The Act itself enables the government to make executive decisions without necessarily having to consult Parliament, provided that the processes are in adherence to administrative justice. What is your issue with how we've been handling this particular problem in this country?
My issue at core is that effectively we've had a Parliament that's been non-existent for 2 years now. The question is, for this term of office, which is already 2 and a bit years into its own term, does that mean Parliament ceases to exist? Because effectively, we are living under a Disaster Management Act. My issue at core is that actually, if Parliament is the way we have agreed as the people of this country to say, we want Parliament to tell us so that we can have our views. At this point in time, no one can make submissions about what type of regulations there are. The tourism industry, the liquor industry, the various industries in this country, mining, whether we want mandatory vaccines or not, all of these issues now cannot just be chosen or decided to by Cabinet and the National Command Council. They must be the people's decisions. We as a country, that's how we govern ourselves. We didn't want a dictatorship. We wanted Parliament. Therefore, I am asking that it must be an urgent task, that Parliament must come back early. We pay parliamentarians a fortune every year. They must reconvene early. They must set up special committees that ensure that regulations are drafted so that, like you see in other nations, for example, take the UK, if the Prime Minister wants to make a decision about whether to enforce lockdowns or not, Parliament is consulted and the people are consulted. Why is South Africa any different? If we create a situation where if you want to lift a curfew, perfect, let's welcome it. But let Parliament have a say, because once you've done that, then the voice of the people is there. Because tomorrow you will come back and say, no, we need to enforce a curfew again. It can't just be at the mercy of the executive. It ought to be guided by laws that govern us in the next number of years while COVID is with us. I do not disregard the fact that this is a pandemic and that we need to take all necessary measures. But those measures must be taken within the guidance of the law, or otherwise the rights of the citizens cannot be suspended forever. We agreed when we drafted the Disaster Management Act that it's okay for us to surrender our liberties for 30 days. We didn't say that 30 days must be renewed for 24 months, because when you create that, you can't ask citizens to give away their rights, their freedoms for 24 months. Their rights and their freedoms must be, as soon as possible, put back at the people, and we do that through Parliament.
Mmusi, just very quickly for purposes of time, I do want to talk about some of the sort of factors that informed Cabinet's decision, the main one being the fact that experts have said that they believe this Omicron-driven wave has in fact receded and that it's moving past its peak, right? But at the same time, we've recently received word from the WHO raising caution about how governments are treating the Omicron variants as well as the Delta variants. The Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, in fact, quoted as saying that both these variants are likely to be creating a tsunami of infections. There does seem to be a misalignment with regards to what the WHO is saying about how we should be treating these variants and how we are here at home responding to the Omicron variant.
Yeah, I think given those factors, I think we've got a global issue that we've got to study from. You'll see European countries moving towards lockdowns, etc. I think every country in this instance must be able to assess its own outcomes. It must be able to look at its own hospitalizations. It must be looking at its own positivity rate, and equally so must take all necessary precautions. And I tend to take the view that, in fact, particularly for the continent of Africa, our death rates have been profoundly low, and in fact, so you cannot compare them to other parts of the world. In fact, our hospitalization rates as a country have in fact been much lower than what we anticipated. So therefore, given the scientific data we have around this issue, and given the fact that we have to be responsive to our own economic needs, which are about ensuring that we still continue trade and we can keep livelihoods in place, I do think that the government must be allowed to autonomously make its own decisions. Because if you just make universal rulings all over the world and say, let each country put similar restrictions, the challenge with that is that not every country is at the same economic level, and ultimately not every country is able to respond with the same level of health care that other countries are able to do. So I think the South African government, in lifting restrictions, is heading in the right direction. Our job now that we've got to figure out is that we must have an emergency response plan in the event that the pandemic goes out of hand, that all of the field hospitals we were promised, all of those are ready and in place, that there's enough ventilation, there's a program of vaccination, so that ultimately we can normalize the lives of South Africans as best as we can. Because I think it's time now that when we look at COVID, we look at it as something that will be with us for a long period of time. SARS is not a new virus in that sense. And ultimately say to ourselves, we need to prepare a world where South Africa can thrive through this and rebuild, because we've missed an opportunity in the last 2 years to rebuild the South Africa we want.
Right. Mmusi, thank you so much. We are going to have to leave it there. That's the leader of One South Africa movement, Mmusi Maimane, giving us the movement's reaction to news of Cabinet approving those new COVID-19 regulations.